we are at a place and time in this country where increasingly our freedom is being called into question, and in some cases is being directly undermined. It is the Democrat elite in Washington and the permanent establishment of the war machine made up of people from both political parties who, in their blind pursuit of power, are doing all that they can to undermine our individual rights and freedoms. It is so great to be here with all of you at such a critical and important time. I'm grateful that you have taken on this most critical cause of defending our freedom. And we hear the Star-Spangled Banner, we read the words on the page, we talk about America, the United States of America being the land of the free and the home of the brave. But unfortunately, we are at a place and time in this country where increasingly our freedom is being called into question, and in some cases is being directly undermined. And it is the Democrat elite in Washington and the permanent establishment of the war machine made up of people from both political parties who, in their blind pursuit of power, are doing all that they can to undermine our individual rights and freedoms. Now, I served in Congress for 8 years, and I wish I could stand here and tell you, well, we'll give them a benefit of the doubt, that they have somehow forgotten the oath that they took to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. They have forgotten the intent of our founders about what they envisioned for this country. Maybe they've forgotten that our founders recognized that power and liberty are natural enemies. Maybe they've forgotten that our founders saw in themselves their most important task to contain government power and protect individual liberties, recognizing that our unalienable rights and freedoms are not given to us by any individual or government entity, and therefore cannot be taken away by any individual or government entity. When I was in Congress, first year I was there, I was excited to learn about a tradition that occurs every year where members of Congress go to the House floor and each take turns reading portions of the Constitution out loud while in session. So I went and was glad to participate, but there weren't very many people there. I asked some of my Democrat colleagues at the time, I said, hey, did you know this was going on? Are you going to go down and participate? And most of the responses that I got was a scoff, saying, oh, that's just a right-wing Republican stunt. I was shocked. I was shocked. But when you look at the actions that are taking place, the policies that they're pushing forward, their complete disregard for the Constitution, then you can understand how the two match. And that's the unfortunate reality, is you can't give them the benefit of the doubt. It's not that they have forgotten their oath, they just don't care. They don't care about individual rights and freedoms. They don't care about our Constitution. What they care about is power and putting their own self-serving interests above all else. Now we're seeing how they are doing that with our rights and freedoms under an almost constant barrage, and I'll go through a few quickly. Freedom of speech, right? Freedom of speech is something that used to be almost universally accepted as something that every one of us must defend and protect, regardless of our politics or affiliations, or whether or not we liked what someone else had to say. We knew every one of us has a right to exercise that right to freedom. That's not the case anymore. This open marketplace of ideas that our founders envisioned for us is being shut down left and right, whether it is in person or in that virtual marketplace of ideas. Our Second Amendment rights, our right to self-defense and to protect ourselves against a tyrannical government. We're seeing this in everything from the recent ban on pistol braces by the ATF and even the Department of Defense and the VA putting forward egregious policies that directly undermine the Second Amendment rights of our servicemen and women and veterans. See, religious freedom, our right to worship as we choose or not at all, is especially being targeted against Christians, peaceful pro-life protesters. We see these efforts to try to erase any mention of God from our public life. The continued assault on our privacy and civil liberties Goes on, we heard about the recent FBI's tens of thousands of violations of the FISA Section 702. We see Congress on the verge of what appears to be yet another rubber stamp approval for the Patriot Act. Unfortunately, this list of violations is long in the ways that they're trying to undermine our rights and exercise their government power over our individual liberties. And in this blind pursuit and hunger for power, they've created in themselves a monster that's willing to do whatever they deem necessary to increase their power. And one of the tactics that they often use, we've seen unfortunately all too often, even in the recent history, is the exploitation of crises, or the creation of crises and emergencies, or new wars of choice, whether they be economic wars or kinetic wars, cold wars or hot wars. They use these events to try to stoke fear in the people, to force us into submission, and use the power of the national security state and law enforcement to infringe on our rights and liberties and to force us to face consequences if we refuse to submit. James Madison warned us about this when he said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. He said, no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. That's what we have seen through most of my adult life. It's what I have experienced as a soldier in seeing the cost and consequences of war. Yes, in human lives. Yes, in taxpayer dollars. And also in the cost of the violation of our rights and freedoms. You know, when I served in Congress, I served on the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs committees for most of the 8 years that I was there. And I was astounded by the fact that every time the Patriot Act reauthorization came up, there were those of us, myself, Tom Massey, and others who recognized how deeply these laws had been violated and abused in the name of national security to go after our individual liberties. And so we introduced legislation to fix this egregious problem, this unconstitutional abuse of power. And every time we did so, there was a bipartisan response calling us traitors, accusing us of welcoming another 9/11-style terrorist attack on America, further fomenting this fear in order to hide what they were really doing. We saw egregious overreach during the COVID pandemic, where the government attempted to, and in many cases were successful in controlling even the most personal parts of our lives, and they continued to ratchet up those measures of control because they saw they could get away with it. They saw there was no accountability, there was no consequences. They saw how they could smear and shut down and silence anyone who dared not only to challenge them, but to merely ask questions. And we're seeing the same thing play out now. We have 2 new Cold Wars being waged against Russia and China. They're working with their friends in the propaganda media and in big tech to push their own narrative, but also to undermine the free speech and rights of anyone who dares to ask the questions every one of us should be asking as Americans, the questions every member of Congress should be asking. What is the true cost of these wars? How will they impact the everyday lives of the American people? How do they serve the best interests of the American people? A few months ago, Representative Comer, the head of the Oversight Committee, introduced legislation called the Protecting Speech from Government Interference Act. And it did exactly as it's titled. It would have prohibited federal officials from doing anything to squelch or censor free speech on the internet. I know you guys are going to be hearing from Matt Taibbi later, but he did an important job in exposing how the FBI both directly and indirectly got Twitter to silence certain people's voices. Now they will say, well, this was done to silence Russian bots or prevent foreign governments from spreading disinformation online, but The reality was most of the people that they were censoring were Americans. They were members of Congress, like myself. They were small business owners. They were heads of nonprofits. They were other journalists. They were everyday Americans who happened to disagree with the narrative of permanent Washington and the Biden administration, and therefore needed to be silenced. Now, every single Republican in Congress voted for this. Every single Democrat voted against it. Their reason? They said, well, the government has an important role to play in making sure, quote unquote, disinformation is silenced in this country. And who gets to decide what disinformation is? They do. They have appointed themselves as the sole authority who gets to determine what is information versus disinformation. And I want to share with you two quotes from Democrats in Congress that kind of stopped me in my tracks. First is Representative Goldman, who's a Democrat from New York. He said that voting against the resolution was a way to stand, quote, with free speech and American democracy. That's a direct quote. Because he feels that the government has the responsibility to stop Russia and China from spreading disinformation. So what is disinformation in their eyes? Well, we know this from what they've done. Disinformation is censoring the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop from voters so that they didn't have the chance to see what was really going on before the 2020 election. There are a lot of other examples we could point to there. There's a Representative Landsman from Ohio who said, quote, why are we being asked to ban American officials from trying to stop propaganda from foreign adversaries like Putin? Why are some proposing we leave Syria, which Putin wants? Why is the call to abandon Ukraine continuing to emerge from some members? He goes on to say, remember, and I'm quoting him, remember, Hitler did this. He used Americans to spread his propaganda, and it cost millions their lives. Putin is doing the same thing. So, to be clear, this congressman from Ohio feels that Americans who dare to say, hey, we need to stop writing blank checks to fund this proxy war against Russia via Ukraine must be silenced. He feels that anyone who says, hey, we need to bring our troops home from Syria are Russian propagandists and must be silenced. This is dangerous because this is coming from people who are in great positions of power to actually act on this nonsense. Now, so far, the Senate has refused to take up this legislation that was passed by Republicans in the House. The court has taken action, banning the federal government from having any contact with social media companies for the purpose of censoring free speech. The Biden administration's response, again, was very bold. They are blatant. They're not even trying to hide it. They said that they're challenging this ruling because they're concerned it will limit their attempts to counter domestic extremism. Who gets to say what domestic extremism is? Well, we can look to them because we know what they say. President Biden declared MAGA Republicans and Trump supporters as the greatest threat to our democracy. Maybe they're referring domestic extremists to the, quote, radical traditional Catholics that the FBI has deemed a threat. Why? Well, in part because they prefer traditional Latin Mass. Maybe it's the parents who are going to Board of Education meetings and protesting against the overt sexualization of their kids that's happening in our schools. Or those who stand up and protest the irreversible mutilation of our kids in the name of gender-affirming care. These are the people that our government, the Biden administration, sees as domestic extremists. These are the people that they want to silence. The Biden administration also expressed that this court ruling would cause, quote, great harm. They're telling the truth. It would cause great harm to their power, to their ability to control us by controlling what information we are allowed to read, what we are exposed to, whose voices we are allowed to hear. What's dangerous about all this is they're directly and indirectly using the national security state and law enforcement, the propaganda media and big tech, all working together in this cabal to silence those who hold views they find objectionable and therefore who threaten their power. They try to intimidate us into silence, into self-censorship by using their smear, attack, and destroy tactics. Hillary Clinton used it against me during the 2020 presidential campaign when she said I'm a traitor, a lie that was repeated over and over and over again. People actually believed this baseless lie. Mitt Romney called me a treasonous liar, which as a soldier is an offense punishable by death. Again, presenting no evidence, but calling me this because I said, hey, there are US-funded biolabs in Ukraine that the Department of Defense has reported that in the midst of a war could be compromised and create yet another global pandemic and crisis. We should probably do something about that. That was grounds for being called a treasonous liar. Anyone who stands up and says, hey, we should not be the policemen of the world. We should not be waging regime change wars around the world. Their label for us is you're a dictator lover. You're a stooge for whatever dictator is in question. Senator Rand Paul being called a Putin puppet because he says we should have some accountability for the money and weapons that we are sending to Ukraine. Reasonable request in the wake of all of the waste and fraud and abuse that we saw for the last 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're seeing the same thing happen with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. right now. They're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at him to try to discredit him as a person and call his character into question so that voters don't pay attention to him. They've used these tactics over and over and over again because they work. Most people don't want to go through what we have been through and what we continue to go through. Most people don't want to be called these names. Most people don't want to be on the receiving end of these attacks and therefore resort to self-censorship. There's no accountability. There's no check on this abuse of power, not even from the media. We have rare journalism coming from people like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald who have the courage to speak the truth. But more and more we see journalism is gone. That fourth estate that we used to be able to trust to speak the truth, to speak truth to power, to tell us what we need to know that the government wouldn't, is largely gone. So the hypocrisy that we're seeing now in the Biden administration and permanent Washington is the fact that we live in a country where they are directly undermining our democracy and freedom here at home, while President Biden goes around the world saying the heart of my foreign policy is to spread democracy and defeat autocracy. And he's doing so with the support of the neocon, neolib foreign policy establishment, where just like here at home, they get to decide whose voices they want to hear or allow us to hear and who must be silenced. Similarly, in foreign policy, they decide which democracies are acceptable and which are not, which autocracies they like and want to support and which they don't. The bottom line is they care about power. That's what drives them. They don't care about us. They don't care about our democracy. And they are trying so hard to silence us because why? Ultimately, they are afraid. They are driven by fear. They're afraid of a free people who think for themselves. They're afraid of a free society. Thomas Jefferson called out their cowardice when he said they prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty. So the ball is in our court. We cannot allow them to continue to destroy our country. We cannot allow them to continue to undermine our fundamental rights and freedoms. We have to stand up and protect them. We have to stand up and exercise them. We have to hold them to account in the ballot box, at the courts, and in the public marketplace of ideas. It's up to us. This is a no-fail mission. If we love this country, if we care about our freedoms, it's up to us to take action to save them. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for all you're doing. Aloha. you.